All right. Let's jump into Hebrews 13:17. I think, every pastor and Bible study leader listening has probably preached on this, taught it, and maybe even felt a little bit stuck with it sometimes. But what we've got today are some sermons and commentaries that go way beyond just the usual obey your leader stuff.
Mm,
We're talking fresh perspectives, sermon illustrations
yeah.
that'll make your congregation go, huh, never thought of it that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's about helping pastors and leaders bring new life to this passage.
So one that really stood out to me was from this new Restoration Outreach Christian Center. They use this analogy of a pastor as a waiter serving spiritual food. And at first I was like, okay, kind of cheesy. But then the more I thought about it, the more brilliant it actually became.
Yeah, it is brilliant. It flips the script on this whole celebrity pastor culture we see today. Instead of the pastor being the main attraction, they're the conduit. They're
Yes.
serving something far greater than themselves.
Yeah, and it really emphasizes that their authority isn't about, personal charisma or platform building. It's about stewardship. They're accountable to God for how they handle the spiritual nourishment of their congregation.
And that accountability goes both ways, too. Because there's this other sermon from One Living Church, and they use this image of Aaron and her holding up Moses' hands during that battle in Exodus.
Oh, yeah.
It's a powerful visual of how the congregation is actually playing a crucial role in supporting their leaders.
I love that illustration
Oh.
because it shows it's not just about blind obedience. There's this element of mutual submission, this understanding that everyone has a part to play in achieving spiritual victory.
And what's really fascinating is how this church connects that idea of supporting leaders to the concept of blessing. They highlight this Greek word makarios, which is often translated as blessed, but it has this deeper meaning of happiness and fulfillment, the kind that comes from being in right relationship with God and others.
So it's like this blessing boomerang. Supporting your leaders actually brings joy and fulfillment to the entire community.
And here's where it gets really interesting. That blessing flow requires discernment. Not everyone who attaches themselves to a leader is doing it for the right reasons. And this same church uses this really vivid, slightly uncomfortable analogy
Yeah.
to illustrate that.
The leech and the remora.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what to make of that one at first either.
Right. But it definitely grabs your attention. So you've got the remora, this little fish that attaches itself to sharks and cleans them. It's mutually beneficial. The remora gets food and protection, and the shark gets a clean bill of health. Then you've got the leech, which, well,
Yeah, we all know what leeches do. They
It's-
just suck the life out of you.
and this sermon really challenges us to ask, okay, which one am I in my church? Am I supporting my leaders in a healthy way, or am I draining them?
It makes you think about the impact your attitude and actions have on the spiritual health of your church.
Absolutely. It's not just about showing up on Sunday and nodding along. It's about being an active, engaged member who contributes to the well-being of the whole community.
And in a world where you can follow any preacher online, that sense of belonging and accountability becomes even more crucial. I mean, Resonate Life Church has this really thought-provoking sermon on this, where they argue that church membership is actually key to understanding submission. Because in that online world, it's easy to become a spiritual consumer,
Yeah.
just bouncing around from one voice to the other without any real commitment.
Right. But membership defines who you're submitted to, who you're accountable to. It draws those lines clearly.
And that accountability, they argue, is essential for spiritual growth. It creates a framework where you can receive guidance, correction, and support from your leaders, and where you can also contribute your own gifts and talents to the community. But they also acknowledge that this idea of submission can be really tricky in today's culture.
Especially in America, where we have this deeply ingrained belief that respect is earned.
Right.
It's like we've taken this core value and applied it to everything, including spiritual authority.
Which can lead to this very subjective view of leadership, where we only submit to those we personally like or agree with.
Yeah.
But the Bible doesn't really give us that option, does it?
Not really. It talks about honoring authority as a divine mandate, regardless of our personal feelings towards the individual in that position.
Right.
And this clash between cultural values and biblical principles can create a lot of tension, especially when it comes to applying Hebrews 13:17. And that's where things get kind of interesting, right? Like, how do you reconcile that tension? How do you navigate this idea of honoring authority, even when it's difficult, even when you disagree with the leader?
Yeah, it's a tough one, especially in a culture that tells us to question everything and trust our gut. But I think that's where discernment comes in. It's not about blind obedience, but it's also not about cherry-picking what parts of the Bible we like.
Exactly. It's about understanding that authority comes from God.
Right.
Which brings us back to that puppet master analogy from Resonate Life
Yeah,
Church.
oh, yeah. The one where fear of man becomes like strings on a puppet. That one really got me thinking.
It is pretty vivid, and it shows how easily we become enslaved to what other people think.
Right. Even when it goes against, what we know is true. It's like we're so scared of being judged or rejected that we end up compromising our values and even our faith. And that fear, man, it can really paralyze us,
It can.
keep us from speaking up, standing up for what's right, and even submitting to the authority that God has placed over us.
And that's the thing about fear of man. It seems harmless, like, oh, I'm just being sensitive to people, or I don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah.
But it's really about protecting ourselves.
Our ego, our comfort.
Exactly. And when we let that fear call the shots, we just end up anxious and insecure, always second-guessing ourselves, trying to please everybody.
Which is the opposite of the freedom and joy we get from surrendering to God and living by His truth.
Yeah. And part of that surrender is recognizing and honoring the authority God gives to leaders in the church.
Right. But it's not about, blind obedience or submitting to abuse.
Definitely not.
Healthy submission is rooted in respect, trust, and a shared commitment to God's will.
Absolutely.
And it requires leaders to actually embody the servant leadership that Jesus showed us.
Yeah, it's not about lording power over others or demanding obedience. It's about leading by example.
Right.
Serving others and guiding them towards spiritual maturity.
And that's where that marriage analogy can be helpful, even though it can be a bit controversial.
Yeah.
I was a little skeptical at first, too, because we tend to view marriage as this 50-50 partnership.
Right.
Which is great, but it doesn't always reflect biblical headship.
That's a valid point. And it's important to acknowledge that the marriage analogy can be misused to justify unhealthy power dynamics or control.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think what One Living Church is getting at is this idea of mutual submission and accountability.
Yeah.
Because even though there's a structure of leadership in marriage, it's not about one person calling all the shots. It's about two people working together,
Right.
submitting to each other out of love and respect.
And that's where stewardship comes back in.
Because leaders are entrusted with the care of God's people. They answer to God for how they lead.
And the congregation in turn has to support, encourage, and pray for their leaders.
To create an environment where everyone can thrive.
It's a beautiful picture of mutual submission, and it reflects the heart of the gospel.
Where Christ, the ultimate leader, humbled himself and submitted to God's will.
Yeah.
And through that, he set us free from sin and fear.
Inviting us into a life of freedom and joy and service.
So as we think about Hebrews 13:17, let's not shy away from the challenge it brings, but let's also embrace the beauty of living in a community where leadership and submission are about love, service, and mutual accountability.
And that's a message worth sharing with our congregations. And that's a message we can really share with, our congregations and our study groups.
It is. But before we wrap up this whole deep dive into Hebrews 13:17, there's one more piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about, the congregations supporting and submitting to their leaders, but what about the leaders themselves?
Right. What about their responsibility in all of this?
Yeah, exactly. Creating a culture of submission isn't just about telling people to obey. It's about building trust, respect, and accountability.
So what does that look like practically? How do leaders create an environment where people feel safe and empowered to submit? Not out of fear, but because they want to.
Well, I think it starts with that servant leadership that Jesus modeled. Leading by example, not by force.
Okay.
Demonstrating humility, integrity, and love for your people.
So instead of demanding respect, leaders earn it by how they treat others.
Right. It's about being approachable, listening to concerns, and valuing everyone in the church.
Creating a space where people feel seen, heard, and appreciated.
And it's about being vulnerable, admitting mistakes, asking for forgiveness. That authenticity builds trust.
It's funny when you describe it that way. It doesn't sound so complicated.
Right.
It's about basic decency and respect.
It is. And I think that's what's so refreshing about these sermons. They cut through all the theological jargon and get to the heart of good leadership.
It reminds me of that image from Exodus. Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' hands. They weren't forced to. They saw he needed help and stepped up.
That's the dynamic we want. It's not about micromanaging or demanding obedience. It's about shared purpose working together.
And when that happens, submission just becomes natural.
It does.
Not about fear or obligation, but wanting to participate and contribute.
So as we finish up with Hebrews 13:17, remember, it's not just a one-sided command. It's a call to mutual submission and accountability.
Leaders have to shepherd their people with humility, integrity, and love. create an environment where everyone can thrive.
And followers have to support, encourage, and yes, submit to their leaders, not out of fear, but because they want to see the church succeed.
It's a tough balance, but it's beautiful.
It
It
is.
requires grace, patience, and willingness to learn and grow.
Definitely.
So let's take this back to our congregations, our study groups, even our own lives.
Yeah.
Let's have real conversations about leadership and submission.
To create communities where we actually live these things out.
And remember, the goal isn't just to follow rules, but to reflect the love and humility and servant leadership of Jesus.
Because when we do that, we create a space where everyone can flourish and grow.
That's a deep dive worth taking every day of the week. Thanks for joining us.